Chapter 15. World War I and the British Mandate. History of Israel, a promise written in smoke, the autumn of 1917, was thick with uncertainty. And yet the smell of wet earth in Europe was mingled with something sharper cordite, blood, and the dying gasps of empires. In a London office, lit by the gray drizzle filtering through frosted windows, a man leaned over a desk, his pen scratching against parchment. Arthur James Balfour, Britain's Foreign Secretary, was not a man given to sentiment. Yet as he signed his name to the letter that would carry his legacy, he could not have imagined the firestorm it would unleash. That short declaration addressed not to a government, but to Lord Rothschild, the scion of a powerful Jewish family, spoke of sympathy with Jewish aspirations for a national home in Palestine. It was barely 2 sentences long, but it carried the weight of centuries of longing and centuries of conflict yet to come. Outside, the war thundered on, swallowing men by the tens of thousands in muddy trenches. But here in the quiet of Whitehall, the seeds of a new war one that would rage for generations were quietly planted. The words of the Balfour Declaration floated across the Jewish world like a spark striking dry tinder. For Zionists, weary from decades of lobbying and ridicule, it was a miracle, a sudden recognition from one of the greatest powers on earth. For the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, who had been told they too would be free after Ottoman rule collapsed, it was a betrayal, a shadow cast across their sunlit hope. Both peoples, locked in the same narrow strip of land, now carried the weight of promises made in wartime whispers. The Great War and the fall of the Ottoman curtain to understand the British Mandate. One must first return to the collapsing Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe. For centuries, Palestine had been a quiet province of that sprawling realm, its peasants tilling stony soil, its merchants bartering in the souk of Jerusalem, its pilgrims trudging toward shrines sacred to 3 faiths. Ottoman governance was distant and often corrupt, but it was familiar. It provided a kind of rhythm. Taxes paid, disputes settled by cadis, soldiers marching only occasionally through village streets. Then the Great War tore the curtain apart. In 1914, the Ottomans joined Germany, dragging their provinces into a European inferno. Suddenly, Palestine was no longer a quiet backwater, but a battlefield. Turkish troops marched south to the Sinai, only to be beaten back by British and Commonwealth forces. By 1917, General Edmund Allenby's armies were advancing northward, taking Gaza, Jaffa, and finally, Jerusalem itself. When Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, he did so deliberately, out of respect for the holy city. Crowds gathered on the cobbled streets, watching this tall, solemn Englishman stride through the Jaffa Gate. For Christians, his presence recalled the Crusaders of old. For Jews, it hinted at deliverance. For Muslims, it was the beginning of an uncertain future. The Ottoman curtain had fallen, but what play would replace it was far from clear. The Balfour Declaration, a promise and a puzzle. The Balfour Declaration did not spring from pure altruism. Britain, fighting for its life against Germany, was desperate for allies and sympathetic publics. Some in Whitehall believed that supporting Zionist aspirations would rally Jews in Russia and America, bolstering the Allied cause. Others, influenced by Bible-soaked upbringings, saw it as a fulfillment of prophecy. Still others believed that a Jewish homeland under British protection would secure a strategic foothold near the Suez Canal, the empire's lifeline to India. Chaim Weizmann, the chemist-turned-Zionist leader, had played his part well. His scientific work, developing a synthetic process for acetone, vital to British munitions, gave him access to ministers who otherwise might have dismissed Zionist dreams as fantasy. With patience and charm, he pressed his case, framing Jewish aspirations not as a romantic whim, but as a practical boon to the empire. And so Balfour's letter was written, spoke of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, carefully balanced by the caveat that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. The ambiguity was deliberate, a diplomat's artful vagueness, but on the ground, in the villages of Galilee and the crowded alleys of Jerusalem, that ambiguity was a ticking bomb. British rule between promise and reality, when the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate over Palestine in 1922, was in effect giving legal cover to what Allenby's soldiers had already secured by force. Britain now found itself master of a land that was both ancient and volatile, a land that resisted being neatly categorized or icily ruled. In the first years, British officials tried to project calm order. They built roads, set up police stations, and introduced British legal codes. They also facilitated Jewish immigration, citing the Balfour Declaration. Ships arrived at Jaffa's harbor carrying new settlers. Some were idealistic young pioneers, sunburned and determined to build kibbutzim from swamp and stone. Others were intellectuals fleeing pogroms and poverty in Eastern Europe. For them, the British flag over Jerusalem symbolized a new chapter of security and progress. But for the Arab population, still the majority, each new ship was a reminder of dispossession. Farmers who had tilled their fields for generations now found absentee landlords selling land to Zionist organizations. And suddenly, they were tenants no more. The new Hebrew-speaking settlements, with their cooperative farms and guarded perimeters, seemed less like neighbors and more like outposts of another nation being built in their midst. British administrators, schooled in the arts of empire, tried to straddle the fence. They issued white papers to reassure Arabs, while simultaneously reaffirming their commitments to Zionists. The result was that neither side trusted them. In the Jaffa, Arabs muttered about betrayal. In the halls of the Zionist Commission, Jews complained of obstruction. The spark of unrest, the first major clash, came in 1920, when riots erupted in Jerusalem during the Nebi Musa festival. What began as religious fervor quickly turned to violence, with Arab crowds attacking Jewish neighborhoods. The British, unprepared, struggled to restore order. 6 Jews were killed, hundreds wounded. For many Zionists, the lesson was bitterly clear. The British could not be relied upon for protection. Soon, self-defense organizations like the Hagan embryos of a future army took root. By 1921, more riots flared in Jaffa, leaving scores dead. The streets reeked of blood and smoke, shutters were smashed, and frightened families huddled in basements. Arabs too saw their dead carried through narrow alleys, their funerals swelling into protests. Each side told itself a story of victimhood, and both were true. For the British, the mandate was becoming a poisoned chalice. High commissioners sent reports back to London that dripped with frustration. The Jews were too demanding, the Arabs too restless, the promises too contradictory. Yet Britain, unwilling to retreat, tightened its grip, layering Palestine with garrisons, intelligence networks, and bureaucratic decrees between two promises. The tragedy of the British mandate lay not only in its violence, but in its duplicity. While promising Jews a national home, Britain had also whispered to Arab leaders during the war that they would gain independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. The famous McMahon-Hussein correspondence dangled visions of an Arab kingdom stretching across the Levant. To add to the confusion, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 had already carved the Middle East into spheres of British and French control. Thus, Arabs felt cheated, promised freedom, given instead a foreign yoke and a swelling tide of settlers. Jews, meanwhile, believed themselves sanctioned by international law and moral right, yet constantly hemmed in by British half-measures. The stage was set for decades of mistrust and fury. The gathering storm by the late 1920s, unrest simmered into open conflict. In 1929, violence exploded over access to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. What began as a dispute over prayer rights escalated into massacres, most infamously in Hebron, where Arab mobs killed 67 Jews, many of them old men, women, and children who had lived peacefully among Arab neighbors for generations. The British, once again, arrived late, their soldiers marching through streets slick with blood, their rifles too slow to stop the killing. The trauma of Hebron seared into Jewish memory, convincing even moderates that coexistence might be a dream slipping away. For Arabs, the violence was framed as resistance to a creeping colonization, a desperate act of defense. Throughout the 1930s, Jewish immigration surged especially. With the rise of Nazism in Europe, the conflict intensified. Arab strikes, British reprisals, Jewish underground activity. The mandate became a crucible of hatred, every act of violence feeding the next. The weight of promises. The British mandate in Palestine is one of history's starkest examples of imperial overreach tangled in moral paradox. Britain, victorious in war, imagined it could engineer stability with a blend of diplomacy, bureaucracy, and bayonets. Instead, it found itself mired in a conflict that no amount of reports or royal commissions could resolve. The Balfour Declaration was both visionary and reckless. It gave hope to a people scattered by centuries of exile, yet it did so without consulting the people already living in the land. The ambiguity of a national home was not a bridge but a trap. For Jews read it as statehood in embryo, while Arabs read it as dispossession in plain sight. For Western readers today, the resonance is profound. The dilemmas of Palestine under the British Mandate, conflicting national aspirations, colonial manipulations, promises made in smoke-filled rooms echo in every negotiation and every eruption of violence in the modern Middle East. On a winter evening in Jerusalem, under the fading light of the Mandate years, British soldiers once stood at checkpoints, while Jewish settlers trudged past with shovels and rifles, and Arab farmers led their donkeys along dusty tracks, their eyes wary, their hearts heavy. The Union Jack fluttered above government buildings, but no one mistook it for permanence. Britain had promised too much to too many, and the land itself seemed to tremble under the weight of those promises. The Mandate was not merely an episode of imperial administration, it was the crucible in which two peoples, both with deep claims and deep wounds, collided under the shadow of an empire that could neither fully control them nor fully let them go. In the smoke of World War I, a declaration had been written. In the dust of Palestine, it became a destiny.